Rippling waves of heat pour from the kiln's mouth like an invisible tide, warping the air so violently that the potter's face appears to melt and reform with every breath he takes. Behind him, stacked on wooden racks like sleeping birds, sit rows upon rows of freshly assembled clay oil lamps, bone dry and pale, waiting for the furnace that will transform them from fragile dust into objects hard enough to hold fire. The temperature inside this updraft kiln, a squat dome-roofed structure the Romans call a fornax, has been climbing for nearly 6 hours, and now it hovers somewhere near 800 degrees, the kind of heat that turns the interior walls a dull pulsing orange. A young apprentice feeds split oak billets through the stoking tunnel at the kiln's base, each log briefly silhouetted against the inferno before igniting from sheer proximity. Smoke, acrid and resinous, curls upward through a ring of vent holes in the dome, and the smell is a thick marriage of charred wood, heated calcium, and the faintly metallic bite of iron-rich clay undergoing chemical metamorphosis. This is Modena, northern Italy, sometime around 90 AD, and the workshop behind this kiln is one of the most prolific lamp-making operations in the Roman world. Stamped on the base of every lamp that survives the fire, 5 letters will announce their origin to buyers in Britannia, Pannonia, Hispania, and beyond. FORTIS. But the kiln is the final act. To understand how a Roman oil lamp comes into being, we must rewind to a quieter, cooler place, the clay pit. Somewhere in the alluvial lowlands near the Po River, where seasonal flooding has deposited millennia of fine-grained sediment, a team of workers digs into earth that is slick, dense, and the color of wet terracotta. The clay they seek is not just any mud. It must possess a specific mineral composition, fine enough to capture the delicate relief of a discus decoration, yet robust enough to withstand thermal shock inside the kiln without cracking. Too much height, and the lamp will bloat with gases during firing. Too much calcium, and it will powder and crumble at high temperature. The ideal clay for Roman lamp production is an ilitic clay, rich in iron oxides, which will fire to a warm reddish-orange and sinter into a dense low-porosity body, somewhere between 700 and 900 degrees. Workers extract this clay in heavy dripping blocks, pile it onto mule-drawn carts, and haul it back to the workshop, where the real preparation begins. In the workshop yard, the raw clay is dumped into shallow settling basins, rectangular troughs cut into the ground and lined with flat stones. Water is added, and the mixture is stirred with long wooden paddles until it becomes a thick, smooth slurry. This process, called levigating, separates the clay by particle size. Coarse sand and gravel sink to the bottom. Fine particles of pure clay remain suspended in the liquid above. After settling for a day or more, workers ladle off the upper layer of liquid clay, which they spread onto flat plaster bats to dry in the Mediterranean sun. What remains after evaporation is clay of extraordinary fineness, smooth as butter between the fingertips, with a faint earthy smell that is almost sweet. This refined body will accept the finest mold impressions without distortion, and it is precisely this level of preparation that separates a crude handmade lamp from the mass-produced masterpieces of a Roman officina or factory workshop. Before that prepared, clay ever touches a lamp mold, however, it must be conditioned. A potter kneads the clay on a stone work surface, folding and pressing it rhythmically with the heels of both hands, a technique called wedging. The purpose is not merely to achieve uniform consistency. Every fold traps and then expels tiny pockets of air. An air bubble left inside the clay body is a death sentence in the kiln. As the temperature rises, the trapped air expands, and the pocket becomes a blister, or worse, a violent rupture that destroys the lamp and potentially damages its neighbors in the kiln stack. The potter works for 10 or 15 minutes until the clay is completely homogeneous, pliant, and cool to the touch. He tears it into portions roughly the size of his fist, each one enough to line half of a single lamp mold. Now we arrive at the heart of Roman lamp production, the device that made industrial-scale output possible: the mold. Roman lamp molds are almost always bivalve. That is, they consist of two halves, an upper half for the discus and shoulder of the lamp, and a lower half for the base and underside. These molds could be carved from several materials. In the Levant, excavations at Shihin, near ancient FORTIS in the Galilee, uncovered molds carved directly from soft local chalk, a material easy to work with fine chisels, but prone to chipping after repeated use. In Italy and North Africa, fired clay molds were more common for permanent workshop use because they could endure thousands of pressings without significant degradation. But perhaps the most ingenious option, and one that Roman lamp makers appear to have preferred for its speed and convenience, was the plaster mold. A plaster mold begins with a master lamp, an archetype carved with extreme care by a skilled artisan, featuring the exact decorative scene desired on the discus, the precise curvature of the shoulder, the profile of the nozzle. This master, or patrix, is itself made of fine clay, hardened to leather consistency. The mold maker coats the top half of the master lamp with a thin layer of oil or animal fat to prevent adhesion, then mixes gypsum plite with water to form liquid plaster. He pours this plaster over the upper surface of the master, carefully working it into every tiny crevice of the decorative relief with a fine brush, ensuring no air bubbles form against the surface. When the plaster sets, a process that takes only minutes and generates a faint warm heat as the gypsum hydrates, he flips the assembly and repeats the process for the bottom half. Once both halves have hardened and been separated from the master, the mold maker trims the edges, carves alignment keys so the two halves will register perfectly, and sets the molds aside to cure thoroughly. The great advantage of plaster is that it requires no kiln firing, unlike a clay mold. But plaster is soft. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the porous gypsum surface deteriorates with repeated use, gradually losing the crispness of the decorative relief, so that lamps produced from an aging mold show progressively blurred details, a form of generational decay that archaeologists can actually track across surviving lamp specimens. Furthermore, plaster molds sometimes trap minute air bubbles during casting, and these produce tiny raised bumps on the finished lamps, a telltale signature that allows modern scholars to distinguish plaster-molded lamps from those pressed in clay or stone molds. With the mold ready, production begins in earnest. The potter takes one of his fist-sized clay portions and presses it firmly into the lower half of the mold, working from the center outward, using his thumbs to push the clay into the curves of the base and the channel of the nozzle. He must achieve a uniform wall thickness. Too thin, and the lamp will crack in the kiln or in daily use. Too thick, and it will be heavy, wasteful of clay, and slow to dry. Experience guides his fingers. He has done this thousands of times. Excess clay is trimmed flush with the mold rim using a thin wire or a flat wooden tool. Then he repeats the process with the upper mold half, pressing clay into the concave depression that will become the decorated discus, the shoulder ring, and the top surface of the nozzle. Now comes the critical moment of assembly. The potter scores the rims of both clay halves with a pointed stick, creating a crosshatch pattern of shallow grooves, and brushes a thin layer of liquid clay slip, called barbotine, onto these scored surfaces. This slip acts as a ceramic adhesive. He inverts the upper half onto the lower, aligns the registration keys, and presses the two mold halves firmly together. A thin fringe of excess clay squeezes out from the seam where the halves meet, what potters call flashing. This seam line, running along the lamp's equator, will need to be carefully trimmed later, but for now it is left in place as the assembly rests. The potter allows the clay to stiffen slightly inside the mold, a stage called leather hard, where it is firm enough to hold its shape, but still soft enough to cut and carve. This partial drying can take anywhere from several hours to a full day, depending on humidity and temperature. Once ready, the mold halves are gently pulled apart, revealing the raw lamp in its nascent form, recognizable in silhouette but rough, with that telltale seam ridge encircling its body like a tiny mountain range. With a small, sharp knife, the potter trims the flashing, smoothing the seam with a wet fingertip or a scrap of dampened linen until it is nearly invisible. On some surviving Roman lamps, the seam line remains faintly detectable, a subtle ridge that archaeological hands can feel even after 2,000 years. Next, the essential holes are pierced. Every functional oil lamp requires at minimum 2 openings: the infundibulum, the central filling hole on the discus through which oil is poured, and the wick hole at the tip of the nozzle, through which the twisted fiber wick extends to meet the flame. A third hole, a small air vent, is sometimes pierced near the filling hole or on the nozzle channel to allow air to flow into the reservoir as oil is consumed, maintaining a steady fuel supply to the wick. The potter uses a thin, cylindrical tool, likely a hollow reed or a rolled bronze tube, to punch these holes cleanly through the still damp clay. If the design calls for a handle, one is hand-formed separately, scored and slipped, then attached to the rear of the lamp body. The attachment point is blended smooth so that the handle appears to grow organically from the lamp's form. Before firing, many workshops apply a surface treatment, a clay slip. This is a suspension of extremely fine clay particles in water, sometimes enriched with iron oxide to produce a glossy red or reddish-brown finish after firing. The lamp is dipped into this liquid, or the slip is brushed on with a soft brush, coating the entire exterior in a thin, even layer. This slip serves 2 vital purposes. First, it creates a denser surface skin that reduces the porosity of the fired clay, helping to prevent the olive oil fuel from slowly seeping through the lamp walls, a common problem with uncoated terracotta. Second, it gives the lamp its finished color and a subtle sheen that buyers associated with quality. Greek potters had pioneered this technique centuries earlier, and the Romans adopted and refined it with characteristic pragmatism. The treated lamps are now set on wooden drying racks in the open air, where they must cure completely before entering the kiln. Any residual moisture trapped in the clay body will flash to steam during firing, and steam expansion inside a sealed ceramic wall is explosive. Days pass. The potter tests each lamp by tapping it with a fingernail. A dry lamp rings with a clear, high-pitched note, while a damp one returns a dull thud. And so we return to the kiln, that furnace we opened with, its belly now aglow. Roman pottery kilns of this era are typically 2-chambered updraft designs, a lower combustion chamber, or prefernium, where fuel is burned, separated from an upper firing chamber by a perforated clay floor that allows heat to rise evenly through dozens of small vents. The lamps are carefully stacked in the upper chamber, often separated by small clay spacers called kiln furniture, which prevent them from fusing together during the melt. The stoker begins with a low fire, gradually increasing the temperature over many hours to drive off the last molecular traces of water without thermal shock. This initial phase, called water smoking, takes the temperature slowly up to around 300 degrees. Then the pace quickens. As the kiln climbs past 500 degrees, the clay undergoes a process called ceramic change. The crystal structure of the clay minerals irreversibly transforms, and the material can never again be softened by water. It is no longer clay, it is ceramic. The firing continues upward toward 800 or 900 degrees, where the iron oxides in the clay begin to flux, and the body sinters into a hard, dense, reddish mass. The slip, with its finer particle size and higher iron concentration, vitrifies into a smooth, semi-glossy surface. The entire firing cycle, from first flame to final cooling, can take up to 2 full days. A day of heating and a day of slow, patient cooling, with the kiln sealed to prevent thermal shock from cracking the finished wares. When the kiln is finally opened, the potter reaches into residual warmth and withdraws the lamps one by one. Each is inspected. Cracked lamps, casualties of uneven drying, air bubbles, or temperature gradients within the kiln are discarded as wasters. Archaeologists have found these rejects at production sites, invaluable evidence of workshop location and quality standards. Successful lamps emerge transformed, hard, resonant when tapped. Their surfaces are rich burnt sienna or deep terracotta red. Their decorative discus scenes, a gladiator in combat, a ship in harbor, an image of the god Mercury, a theatrical mask, now crisply rendered in permanent ceramic relief. The finished lamps are now ready for their maker's mark. On the base of each FORTIS lamp, the word is impressed into the clay before firing, a brand name recognized across the empire, the ancient equivalent of a stamped trademark. This workshop near Modena, active from roughly 70 AD to 230 AD, produced lamps on a staggering commercial scale, and the FORTIS stamp appears on lamps excavated from Hadrian's Wall to the Danube frontier to the coastal cities of North Africa. Other workshops had their own marks: Strobili, Communis, Florent, each associated with specific regional production centers and distribution networks. These marks allowed buyers to identify quality and origin, and they allow modern archaeologists to trace trade routes across the ancient Mediterranean with remarkable precision. The lamps were packed for transport in straw-filled baskets or nested in wooden crates, their hollow bodies light enough to ship in great quantities aboard merchant vessels or in the back of ox-drawn wagons along Roman roads. Upon arriving at their destination, a market stall in Londinium, a shop in Corinth, a military supply depot along the Rhine, the lamps would be sold for a modest price, affordable to soldiers, shopkeepers, and household slaves alike. In use, the lamp is filled through the central discus hole with olive oil, the most common fuel throughout the Mediterranean, though sesame oil, castor oil, and even linseed oil served in regions where olive trees did not grow. A wick of twisted linen or papyrus fiber is threaded through the nozzle hole, one end submerged in the oil reservoir, the other protruding just beyond the nozzle tip. Capillary action draws the oil steadily upward through the fiber, feeding the small, steady flame. Experimental archaeology has measured the light output of these lamps at between 1400ths and 3000ths of a lux near the flame, dropping to 100th of a lux at a distance of about 4 feet. By modern standards, this is extraordinarily dim, barely enough to read by, just sufficient to prepare a meal or navigate a room without stumbling. And yet this was the light that illuminated the Roman world after dark. The warm, flickering orange glow under which letters were written, prayers were offered, and lovers whispered. The nozzle of a well-designed Roman lamp includes a shallow channel on its upper surface, a Roman innovation that serves a deceptively clever function. As the wick burns, tiny amounts of oil creep along the fibers and drip from the nozzle tip. The channel catches this runoff and guides it back toward the lamp body, preventing messy stains on tables and shelves and conserving precious fuel. Over time, the nozzle tip blackens with soot, and the area around the wick hole develops a characteristic burn scar, a dark carbonized halo that archaeologists use to confirm that a lamp was actually used, and not merely a votive offering placed unused in a tomb or shrine. And the tombs received many of them. Romans buried lamps with their dead in enormous numbers, believing that light guided the departed through the darkness of the underworld. Lamps deposited in graves were sometimes brand new, still carrying the crisp mold lines and unblemished slip of an unused object. Others bore the soot stains of long household service before being retired to accompany their owner on a final journey. In some ritual contexts, lamps were deliberately broken, their decorated discus punched out or snapped off, in acts of intentional destruction, whose precise meaning scholars still debate, though the practice clearly carried deep symbolic weight. From the muddy alluvial floodplain to the settling basin, from the potter's kneading stone to the plaster mold, from the careful piercing of a wick hole to the two-day inferno of the kiln, the Roman oil lamp embodies a production chain of extraordinary sophistication, hidden inside an object small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Each lamp is a miniature archive of Roman industrial ambition, standardized, branded, exported across thousands of miles, yet shaped by the individual pressure of a potter's thumbs inside a mold. When you hold one today, 2,000 years after the last flame went out, your fingertips rest in the same grooves, where a Roman craftsman's fingers pressed wet clay into gypsum, working by the light of a lamp exactly like the one he was making